Dick Sherman, blues producer and historian, around Chicago almost 50 years, and it's October 15, 2017, and I have the pleasure of interviewing my friend and one of my favorite, not only musicians, but blues music advocates and activists, Mark Naftalin, reminiscing about our mutual survival of the University of Chicago, the same dormitory, the same floor a few years apart, and the musical road since then. Well, for starters, Mark, on one of your visits to Chicago a few years ago, you had some tapes that a childhood friend of yours had given you of one of your earliest bands in Minneapolis. Can you talk about how you got started with music?
I started with music when the piano came into the house. After we moved from the apartment to the house, that was in southeast Minneapolis, that would have been 1948. And then around about 1949, when I was 5, the piano came in and I was attracted to it. I was not an instantaneous prodigy, I wasn't like Mozart or anything, but I liked to fool around with it. And I used to entertain my parents' friends sometimes. We were sitting under, this was upright piano, we get down under where the keyboard was, and reach up and play simple melodies like this, Mary Had a Little Lamb. I guess that was where it all began. And then I started lessons when I was in about 3rd grade, I was 8. And probably around 5th grade or so, I was attracted to other songs than just simple whatever children's songs or things that every child would hear. Things that were starting to come into the public ken of children, especially grade school kids, late 5th graders and so on, rock and roll in other words. And I heard Leadbelly. That was really the first black music that I heard. And I was very fascinated by that. I listened to it a lot with a friend of mine, Steve Tomes. And so I started trying to get involved with those kinds of sounds. The Fats Domino was a big early influence I would imitate, you know, as and try to play that in some way or another, Blue Monday. And so I started working on my style. I didn't know I was working on my style. I didn't know it was a style, but I was trying to play what I wanted to play. And that proceeded along. And then when I was about 13, I was able to prevail upon my mom to allow me to stop the lessons. I didn't want to take any more lessons. But I kept on playing it. When I was 14 in 9th grade, that's when I got the job with Johnny and the Galaxies. And that was a working band in Minneapolis. And we played around different places, most often at a place called the Crystal Coliseum. That was a dance hall in Crystal, Minnesota, near Minneapolis. That burned down in '61. That was the same year that I went to Chicago and started school here at the University of Chicago. But I played with them for 2 years, and there are some recordings of those.
Is that rock and roll mostly? Or?
It was rock and roll, but we had some blues. It was not patterned on Chicago blues per se, but for example, we recorded these 2 tunes, Blue Comet Blues by Bill Haley and 3:30 Blues by Duane Eddy. And in those songs, Johnny Cayola, was the leader of the band, and he was the Johnny of Johnny and the Galaxies, pretty much copied the solos right off the records. He was not much of an improviser, but he was a pretty competent guitarist. It was a good band, you know, and people liked us, and people danced to it. But when I would play a solo, I would, of course, play my style. I would improvise. And it worked out pretty nicely, and I was with them till '61, and then I went to college.
Were you, during your concert today, you mentioned that Jimmy Yancey was your piano idol. Were you aware of him before you came to Chicago?
Yes, I was. The aforementioned Steve Tomes and his family, they had the Jimmy Yancey album that came out of the X label. It was a 10-inch record, if you remember with it. It had some of his best stuff on it. And so I was able to study that. And it really got me. It got inside me. And of course I learned much more about him later when I was able to acquire records and become a self-styled scholar and study a lot of things.
So what led you to choose the University of Chicago as a place to go to college?
Well, I applied to 3 colleges. Harvard, Yale, and the University of Chicago. Of course, Harvard and Yale, fortunately for me, not saying that they ever would have admitted me, but they did not. and that was a good thing. But I don't exactly know how I was steered to the University of Chicago. I guess I knew it was a good school. One of my schoolmates had come here, but I think my parents maybe knew someone that was a representative of UC, and maybe a connection was made there. And I can't tell you exactly why did I apply, because it didn't come from my independent impetus. It couldn't have. I just don't think I had that much knowledge. I picked Harvard and Yale because I had delusions of grandeur. I thought they were known as the best schools and so on. But did you know that recently there has been a bitter rivalry between Harvard and Yale? They're vying to be the legitimate recognized school on the East Coast that is known as the University of Chicago of the East. It's right up there with the football rivalry. Did you know that? Yeah.
When you came here, I know you were a music major when you came here, did you have music in mind to pursue before you got here, or did that evolve during your time here? I remember Elvin told me he chose physics because he found out that if he could pass the tests, he didn't have to put in the lab time, so it left him more time to go chase Smokey for guitar lessons and stuff like that. Did you have more of an overt plan about being a music major, or did that sort of happen as he went along?
I was in my last years in high school, when I was in the process of applying to colleges, and then I would have to state what my interests were and write the essay or whatever it was, and I didn't quite have the maturity to visualize myself really as a professional musician, notwithstanding the fact that I was already playing with the band. I already was a musician. I mean, I was playing. But when I got here, I placed all the math, and so I did well enough to get into the advanced section of calculus, and that was the end of math for me. I was thrust into the middle of the best math and science brains of my generation. You know, and so at the end of that quarter, I transferred from calculus, calculus 151, I think it was, to music 152, diatonic harmony. And I had studied enough theory in Minnesota. I had taken myself to a music school in Minneapolis, and I got some instruction there. And I was very interested in music theory. And so I had enough to start that sequence in the second quarter. And I think it must have been somewhere not too long thereafter that I realized what was so obvious, really, which was that I was going to be a music major. And that settled that. And I went on through that sequence with great appreciation for the instruction that I got from very good teachers at this school.
And you made it through in 3 years. Were you just packing extra coursework in?
No, I just placed out of 1 year's worth.
Ah, nice.
Yeah, it was great.
Now, did you tap into the on-campus music scene before you started making rounds outside of campus, or were you already tapping into the city's music scene before you connected with things like the twist parties?
The twist party started as a record-playing party in the new dorm, which was a new dormitory that was known as the new dorm, but it was really, what was it called?
Woodward, right?
Okay, I guess, something like that. And it started as a record-playing party during my first year, that was a 61-62 school year. And then bands started coming, and musicians started showing up and kind of jamming in different combinations, and then it became whole bands, and there'd be more than one band at a time. At one point I was there were 3 bands playing at once. This was even beyond Dixieland for complexity of interwoven melodies. And that's the time that I spoke with Mike.
And Paul Butterfield and Elvin were both important parts of
Well,
that scene, right?
well, I'm going to say that was the beginning of it, and then it moved over to Ida Noyes Hall. And whether Paul and Evan played when it was at the New Dorm, I don't really remember seeing them there, but that's not authoritative. But when the event moved next door to Ida Noyes Hall and took place in the ballroom there, they became the house band, Paul and Elvin, and they had a rhythm section called the Wilson Brothers. And that was their band, and they had a sign by the door that said, admission, 10 cents for beer for the band. And I used to look forward to those things like nobody's business.
And this was during the heyday of the twist, so yeah, it was a reference to Chubby Checker, et cetera.
Yeah, Chubby Checker was a progenitor of the twist, and it was a big thing, and so these were twist parties. And twisting was observed at the twist parties.
Well, now we can say this interview was twisted.
I didn't really tap into much of a scene in the city. I was with the twist parties from early on, and I did partake in some things during my 3 years here. I went to some Chicago Symphony concerts. We used to get dollar tickets, you know, for those. High up, they were in the auditorium somewhere. And I went to, I heard Coltrane at McKee's, you know, that was fantastic.
Nice.
Yeah, really wonderful with his classic quartet. And I saw Ray Charles at the Regal, and that was pretty good. And I saw B.B. King on the west side of the place where they just sort of setups, and that was nice. But I wasn't really going to South Side clubs. I was underage, you know. I wasn't as bold as some of my compatriots, really. And I wish I had now, but
Yeah, I had the world's worst fake ID, but it worked everywhere.
I think I put together an ID for McKee's, but I don't even know if they looked at it. I just don't think there was much pressure on that. Or if there was, I didn't see it in action.
Did you get to see many of the local piano players, either the gut bucket people like Otis Spann, or maybe the older stylists like Jimmy Yancey, or others who are still around from that the house for rent generation?
There was one, Curtis, was it Curtis? What was his name?
Curtis Jones?
I think it could have been. I'm not 100% sure, but this is a real guy, and he played in Shorey House. You know, they brought him in, and he played, and I sat kind of at his feet and watched him. That was rare. I saw Yank Rochelle and Ransom Nolan and some other people I don't remember, and I think that was in Ida Noy's ballroom. And these are just things that were set up for the students, you know. And I interacted with Big Joe Williams when they brought him in. He was sitting at a table with white tablecloth and china and a silver tea service. And I understood some of what he said. It wasn't fully open to me, but he was very nice. And years later, when I tried to book him, well, I did book him. He claimed to remember me, but he didn't make it to our festival because he got about as far as Colorado or something. His doctor insisted that he return to Mississippi, and he didn't live much after that. I got somebody else in his place.
Oh, so this would have been like 70s or later on.
That was in the 80s.
80s, okay. Yeah. So you mentioned Shorey House. So one of the things we have in common is we both lived on the same floor of Pierce Tower a few years apart.
Up high.
Really? And we both survived. Do you remember any music at all in Pierce Tower?
Only what I played in the piano room every day. That was a small room. There wasn't usually anybody around, and if it filtered out, I don't know about that.
Yeah, I booked the Aces and Bobby King for a dance in the basement, and the Blackstone Rangers stole the cash box at the end of the night.
Boy, that's the blues.
A memorable evening, yep. Or as the police said, that cash is headed south toward 63rd Street. Well, after yours. So when you started gigging in Chicago, who were your first gigs with around here? Was that with Butterfield, or were you doing other stuff?
I wasn't even trying to be a professional musician while I was in college. When I was in the Butterfield band, after just a couple things on the East Coast, the band came back to Chicago, and we played at Big John's.
I was going to ask you if you were part of the Big John's scene.
Well, I was at that point.
How long did you partake in that?
Well, we were probably there for 4 or 5 weeks, and then we would come back. When we came back to Chicago, we would play there for a while. And then the band started to, move up in terms of level of gigs. And I remember the guy, I can't remember his name, the guy that ran Big John's. He was sing.
It's a Wentlofer or
Yeah,
something
something
like
like
that.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he was just saying, oh, I guess the Butterfield band's gotten too big for Big John's, and he was outraged.
Was it through Butterfield that you met Mike Bloomfield, or
No.
how did that happen?
I met Mike, well, the first time I interacted with Mike was at the Twist Party before it left New Dorm. And I had mentioned this when I was playing upstairs, that he had come in with a band. And he was very, very frantic and playing really fast. And so without introducing myself, I spoke to him when this was over. And I said, "Say, man, how come you play so fast?" And he says, "Because I practice all the time." Well, I let that go at that. It sounded, I guess it was an answer, you know, kind of a non-answer really. But later on when I got to know him, I reminded him about that. And he said, "Oh, that was a lie. However, I think that you don't get to play that fast or that well without practicing a lot. That's a given." And so when he told me that it was a lie, that was a lie.
Did you know Peter Amft? He was a photographer. He was a
No.
running buddy of Michael's during adolescence, and he told me that they would go to the workshops during the folk festival here, and Mike would, go up to these, bluegrass guitar players and people like that and play all their songs back at him at 4 times the tempo, which we can debate whether that's more musical, less musical, whatever. But anyhow, yeah, speed was obviously a big thing with him at that.
That's quite a large factor.
Yeah, well, I could kind of reiterates what you were saying. That was a lot of what he was about. I always had the feeling that in the Butterfield band that you and he were the closest to being the soulmates in the band, that Elvin was more with like the Southern Country Boys and you and Mike were more urban Jewish wise asses in the band. Is that anything close to fair?
Who were the Southern Country Boys? You mean Sam?
Jerome and Sam.
Well, Jerome's from Chicago.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. Well, Mike and I became really good friends. And I believe, he didn't say this, but I believe that he appreciated the fact that there was somebody else with some Jewish heritage in the band. But we were very good friends, and we worked together a lot over the years. Great deal. Many years after we were both out of the Butterfield band, and many engagements.
Let's we'll double back on the Butterfield days, but before we do, what took you out of Chicago to New York, and did you go anywhere else in between?
No, I didn't. I wanted to study composition at a conservatory. I wanted to study at a conservatory, and I was interested in composition, and I was starting to do some composing, and I was interested in contemporary music. I don't think that I had any vision of myself as really becoming a composer in that field. Or maybe I did, but it was not my first goal. I mean, during all of my training, and I wasn't trained as a classical musician. If I'd wanted to be a classical musician, I would have stayed with the piano lessons. That was all based on classical music, as piano lessons pretty much always are. I mean, blues, you can't learn that in school, period. But my own music, which was blues played my way, that was always the main thing for me. All the time that I was studying theory, music theory, and everything else in college and everywhere else, I was always doing that. And so even when I went to New York and I got an apartment and I studied the 1 year at the Mannes College of Music, and it was very, very good. And I went into the last year of their theory sequence, which I was prepared to do after the good instruction that I got with the diatonic harmony and the chromatic harmony and the year of counterpoint at UC.
Yeah, by the way, who were some of the... Go ahead.
But I brought my piano with me, and I kept playing every day my music, pounding it out. And at a certain point, I wanted to get in a band. I had played in the band before, and the bands were happening, and the Beatles were happening, big time. And in that era of guitar-based bands, I didn't think there was perhaps much opportunity for a piano player, so I got a hold of an electric bass, and I knew how to play bass lines. I mean, I knew the strings of the guitar. I wasn't a great stylist on guitar, but I could certainly play bass lines on something that was tuned the same as the bottom four strings of a guitar. And so I practiced up on that in my apartment. And then I used to go up to the village. I'd walk around, and I was downtown at the Lower East Side, you know. And I would walk around with my bass or not, and I would approach people that looked like they were involved with music, i.e. they had long hair. And I got a couple of gigs like that. But I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. Were you a self-taught guitarist? You mentioned that you would do some of that at the twist parties. Did you have guitar lessons, or
Well,
did you just?
I took some classic guitar lessons for a while, and I love classic guitar. But I mean, I don't consider myself anything other than a self-taught pianist. I mean, I think it was very good to have the experience of taking piano lessons. It was good for my hands, and it was good for the teachers that I had. They were good teachers, and they imparted theory as well as practice, and that was a good experience. But I don't see that I really, in a substantive way, carried that over into my own music. My own music comes from doing it day in and day out all these decades, and that it was that way from the beginning.
Yeah, and blues has a different wellspring, needless to say. But having said that, what I started to interrupt you by asking a minute ago was, you've mentioned having some good instructors at the University of Chicago. I was
Yes.
wondering if you could cite instructors that you thought particularly had an impact on you.
Well, I had three instructors. H. Collins Slim was one of them. I don't know what the H was for. He's a very nice man. I liked him a lot, and he taught the diatonic harmony course. I took the last two courses. He also taught the music history course that I took. That was one of the requirements for graduating in music. And he was also the conductor of the UC Symphony, in which I played trombone for a while. Not very well. I wasn't very good at following the scores, really. But it was a good experience. That's really a tangent. And then the chromatic harmony course was taught by Easley Blackwood. And he was a phenomenon and a very impressive and inspiring musician and person. And I got to know him pretty well. And I took his chromatic harmony course. As I said, and the first two courses were chromatic harmony. He had studied, with Boulanger in Paris and with Hindemith at Yale. And he was a virtuoso. I saw him play the Ives Concord Sonata and the Boulez Second Sonata, which looks like a briar patch on the page. 45 minutes each, very complex. Ives is more harmonic, but nevertheless extremely complex. He played them both from memory, back to back. I witnessed that close up at Mandel Hall. The third quarter of his course was the theory of intonation, very mathematical. He later wrote a very in-depth textbook, which I later read, and I'm not able to dissert on the theory of intonation, but I do know something about it. And he also put out a CD that had compositions that he made in equal intonations between 13-tone equal intonation and 24-tone equal intonation, in which they displayed what the harmonic possibilities of those different intonations were. Each one had a different sort of take on some of the combinations within those many, more and more as it went towards 24.
Yeah.
But there were different major and minor chords that were available, and seventh chords and ninth chords and so on. So he wrote these pieces that would illustrate that, and those were, I think they were executed on a synclavier or something, which would be programmed to do it. I mean, I have trouble picturing anybody actually performing those, but maybe he did. He was very, very good and very brilliant. And he's an unforgettable inspiration to me because of the way that he taught. He wanted his final exam, I think, in winter quarter. He assigned everybody a figured bass. A lot of his chromatic harmony studies around solving figured basses. You do that pencil and paper. He assigned each student a different one. There weren't very many students in the course. And the one he assigned me was quite complicated. But the idea was you had to solve the bass and then learn to play it in all 12 keys. And so I did that. And I played it first in A for him, and I thought to myself, God, great, this is the hard key. And then he gave me F sharp. The point about it was it modulated so much, it really didn't matter what key you were in. It was very, very challenging. And he challenged me, and that's a good thing. And I have made a point of playing in all keys. I play blues in all keys. I can play boogie. I can play boogie woogie in all keys. And I used to do that as a practice drill, ritually. It's not. I don't really choose to try to make a showpiece out of that. I prefer to play boogie woogie in the standard keys. There are good reasons for that. And then the final sequence was counterpoint. Howard Brofsky was the name of the teacher, and that was very good.
So when doubling back to New York, at the time that you reconnected with Butterfield, you were still strictly a piano player, right?
Well, I had learned to play bass enough to get a couple of gigs, but I was really not intending to be a bass player. Although I did get an offer to play in the Buffalo Springfield as a bass player, but I turned that down. I was in with Butterfield. So
how did the Butterfield reconnection happen when you were in New York?
Well, when the band came to town first, it was a 4-piece band, and I don't know how I hooked up with Alvin. I knew Alvin more than Paul, but Alvin did come over to our apartment where I lived with my girlfriend at the time, and we gave him dinner. And then I went to the gig. It was at the Village Gate. It's a 4-piece band. And I must tell you, it was one of the greatest things I've ever seen. It was pure Butterfield. And as great as the band always was, it was never as pure as that. And it was dynamite. I tell you this just to say that I tried to keep a connection. I don't remember exactly how I just must have found out where they were and gone to, I wasn't staying on the phone with Alvin, so I didn't know him that well, but that's something that happened. And then when they came back in the summertime, Mike was with the group, and I insinuated myself into their presence. That's when I met Mike for real and got introduced by name and had a chance to talk with him a little bit. And I remember I had a beer with Butterfield in the bitter end, and he told me Mike was the blues guitarist in America that he most would want to have in his band. And they were in and out of town a little bit. I wasn't pulling Butterfield's coat saying, hey man, can I get in the band? That would have been hubris. I never would have done that. I think they went to Newport and they came back. And honestly, I don't remember how this came about, but what happened was that I played a set with them at the Cafe au Go-Go. Paul must have invited me to do it. I would not have said, say, could I play a set with you? Can I come up with your gig? No. Once again, hubris. I was not hubristic. But it was parallel to the situation at the twist parties where I would play along on this little piano with the sidelines. Never invited, but never discouraged.
Was it a piano?
It was a small piano at the side of the stage, unamplified, just like at the twist parties. The band head was amplified. I was acoustic. Same thing at the Cafe au Go-Go. I don't know who heard it. I don't know if it was some kind of addition. Maybe it was. It wasn't stated that way. It's just something that happened. I still was not imagining myself in the band. That would have been hubris, okay? And then this time came where there was a recording session. They had recorded an album. They had rejected it for release. And they were continuing to record. And so I knew where the session was taking place. September 8th, 1965 was the date I went there. And they were talking about maybe trying some organ at the end of the session. And I guess the insinuation was that I would maybe have a chance to do that. And quite unbelievably, I was impatient. I went home, back to my apartment. I never will know why I did that, but it didn't matter as it turned out, because the next day, September 9th, I went back, and at the beginning of the session, Alvin was late. And this was 4-channel recording. He had a channel. They put me on his channel. And they wanted organ, so I played organ. I was not really familiar with organ at all. I played home organs maybe, but really, I don't think I'd ever played a Hammond organ.
What kind of organ was it? Was it a
Hammond,
B3?
yeah. And we played the song. It came out of the first album under the title "Thank You, Mr. Poobah." I played a solo. Didn't particularly make any mistakes, such as it was. And so Paul said at the end of the song, he said, "Well, keep playing." And so I played on a succession of songs, still not really visualizing myself in the band, because I didn't want to get ahead of myself. But then as late in the session, it was a triple session, 9-hour session, and Paul did induct me into the band. He said, "Would you like to join the band and go on the road with us to Philadelphia this weekend?" I said, "Yes." And I was with him for 2.5 years. And I didn't get fired.
The title Mr. Poobah, that was a reference to Paul Butterfield, I assume? That was Poobah, or did you have something else in mind? Or who did name it?
Because of the consonants, P and
Just
D?
yeah.
I always wondered if it might have been referring to me, but I don't know. Nobody said so.
So you didn't title it?
I did not. I was credited as a co-writer because I was one of the soloists. And the people who were left out of that were the rhythm section. So there's a strict racial divide there, and I always felt uncomfortable about that. I thought if the musicians were being credited, why pick out the soloists? This was not a trio act, the rhythm section was key, and it's a great rhythm section.
So when you got with the band full time, how much time were you spending on the road? Was it pretty much nonstop or intermittent?
Well, it was mostly nonstop, but not in the sense of one-nighters. I kept my apartment in New York, and I would still stay there when we came back to New York. We kind of headquartered out of New York. After a while, though, I let that go. But we did play engagements, weekends, week-long engagements, 2-week-long engagements, sometimes more. When we got to the Golden Bear, in California, Southern California, we'd stretch out there for a while. That was quite idyllic. But we were on the road, definitely.
Were the ballrooms starting to happen by then, or were you mostly just doing clubs?
Well, the Fillmore was happening, and that was the vanguard of the ballroom scene. And for a long time, we never played anywhere in San Francisco except at the Fillmore. And when we arrived in San Francisco in the early 1966, unbeknownst to us, at least it was certainly unbeknownst to me, we were the biggest thing in town. It was amazing. And we were very popular there, and we played there quite regularly. We weren't headquartered in San Francisco. We stayed for certain intervals. We would stay in the Bay Area, but usually we would just be going in and out.
How long did it take you and the other people in the band to start seeing the Bay Area as a place to live, not just a place to come through and play regularly? Did that happen pretty quickly when you saw what it was like, or did it take a while to sink in?
That's a good question.
You didn't have to live in Chicago or back east where it was cold.
It's a good question, and it's very true that by the time I left the band, I had the idea in my mind that I was going to settle in the Bay Area. I'm not sure exactly how that settled in, at what point it became a realization. It just kind of was there at some point, or over some nebulous line of time. And that's what I did. But it wasn't, California never was really home to me. I never figured I was going to spend the rest of my life there. But it was nice while it lasted, which was a long time.
You mentioned, you said you didn't get fired. What motivated you to leave the band, which was, by the way, right before I saw them for the first time. So just missed seeing that. Yeah. But what was the trigger for that?
Well, the music was changing. I was tired of being on the road.
Was Paul going more toward the jazz fusion thing by then?
Well, it wasn't really what he was doing. Phil Wilson and Alvin Bishop were doing their idea of, I shouldn't say their idea, but Philip Wilson was a bona fide avant-garde jazz drummer. He was also a very good blues and rhythm and blues drummer, and he was a singer, and he was a good musician and a good guy, but he carried drumsticks with him, and he beat on everything, garbage cans, anything that was in sight. And he was very good percussionist. And Alvin was doing his experimental music where he would loosen up a guitar string, and then he would come up above the nut with his hand. And it was a kind of a coda-like effect, but it was not precise at all. It was like a theremin. You can never find the right. And so, some of the music was going in that direction. It was not any longer a band of just resting on tight arrangements as it was in the first place. And originally it was all Chicago blues. And then as we developed together, before Mike left the band, it was still, it went beyond Chicago blues into different kinds of soul music and Percy Mayfield music, other fields of blues, but always with arrangements. Billy Davenport, the great drummer for plain arrangements, and that had his presence had a lot to do with our ability to grow. And so that the band maintained complete excitement for me all during that time. And when Mike left, for a while we continued with one guitar player. Jerome left, Bugsy came in, good singer, and great guy, a real good friend of mine. He's not alive anymore. And so it didn't, as long as Billy were there, it didn't really go away from, being a tight band. And I'm not saying when Philip came in that it wasn't tight, but it was, the musical emphasis had shifted. And what was happening was not, some of it didn't feature Butterfield at all. In the beginning, everything featured Butterfield. And until Bugsy came in there, he was the only vocalist. After Mike came, instead of being almost all the solos being Paul's, Mike had a lot of solos, and the band kind of revolved around the axis of Mike and Paul. And of course we did East West, which was an experimental piece, and it was very exciting to audiences. We played it longer and longer. Finally, it was over an hour.
Yeah, you told me once, and I thought it was totally on target observation, that as good of a blues drummer as Sam Lay was, that you couldn't have done East West with Sam on drums. That Billy was a key ingredient to that. Can you comment on what Billy brought to the band? By the way, I still love the gigs you did at Smoke Daddy when you had Billy, and when you brought Bugsy too. That was extra cool too. But you and Billy had such a nice thing going. Billy was a great drummer,
He was
so
a great
melodic.
drummer. I loved him.
And
so
a nice
much.
guy. I remember that day we thought we were going to get some recording done, and it didn't happen.
I know.
But can you talk about how he changed the essence of the Butterfield band when he came in?
Well, it's conjectural as to whether the things that we did when Billy was there would have been done. I think it's logical to surmise that some of the Percy Mayfield songs, some of the Percy Mayfield songs and some of the soul songs that we did when Billy was there could well have been done with Sam. Sam is an excellent musician and wonderful drummer. His style is delightful, really great.
Yeah, but nobody would ever call Sam jazz inflected.
No, Billy was a jazz school drummer, and he had worshipped, or I don't say, his idol was Art Blakey, and he used every part of every cymbal and every part of every drum head, and he used mallets, and he carried brushes and mallets and sticks, and he was very coloristic. If you listen to the album that we put out on our label, the Winter label, East West Live, 3 live versions of East West, and if you follow those through and you hear all the things that the band does, every one of those is different, and Billy's always there with a beat or with something. At first, I was with Mike and Billy in the studio, when they were working up this beat. They wanted a basic beat for the song, and Billy was throwing out these different Latin beats, and they kind of settled on this. I don't know if that's a cha-cha or it's some kind of a Latin beat, and that's where the rhythm started. But then, he would follow where Mike went and where the band went, and he had the ability to do that. And so if you listen to those 3, that's something like 57 minutes or something of East West, and if you just listen to the drum part, you'll be amazed at what he played. And it's very interesting. And he was very skillful. And I loved him so much.
Yeah, he was. I really enjoyed the conversations with him when you would come to town, and particularly I remember one time at Bob's place for one of those dinner parties when Billy brought his drums, and remember he was talking about how he cut his teeth on the house rent parties with the big boogie piano players. So I always figured he had an extra empathy for playing with keyboards too.
I don't remember hearing him say that. I might have been out of the room then. But I know he told me that Jimmy Yancey and Mommy Yancey lived around the corner from him when he was a kid. He used to run to the store for milk for Mommy Yancey. He said he heard Boogie Woogie coming out of that apartment all the time. I mean, that's the font right there. I mean, he had that. That was part of Billy.
Yeah, it's funny how that kind of works. I remember Dave Myers used to tell me Lonnie Johnson lived in the basement of their building, but whenever they would hang around trying to listen to him practice, he'd cuss at him and run him off.
Who was that?
Lonnie Johnson, Lewis and Dave Myers.
Oh, yeah.
What kind of band leader was Paul? What was it like working for him? There are lots of colorful stories, let's just say.
It was easy. Working for him was easy.
Was he a democratic kind of a band leader?
Yes.
What kind of musical input did you have? Are there examples you can point to other than "Thank You, Mr. Poobah" that you would say are things that you brought into the band?
Well, on the song "Drifting Blues," the horn players had this riff. They were trying to work up a horn arrangement. When I got to the rehearsal, they had this riff. And that's all they had. And so, and then it's, what is it? That's what it was. Well, I put that in, and then I wrote the rest of the arrangement, which was mostly just those little brief horn parts, and Paul would play in between accents and just short stuff. And it was two horns at the time, and I wrote out the parts for them. So with the exception of that riff, I wrote the arrangement. Period. And then when it came time for One More Heartache, and it's got this sequence of chords that descending fourths. That was my arrangement, and I wrote out the parts for the horns, and that comes in a couple of times, and that was definitely an addition. They weren't going to do that, except that I came with that idea and showed them the notes to play, and then when Sanborn came in, and I redid both of those passages for both of those tunes, the horn parts for three horns expanded from two, and that was much better. It's much better to have three on those parts. That's really three-part harmony, and I probably contributed to other arrangements.
And you mentioned the Pig Boy Crabshaw album. When those songs appeared, that was when the horns came in, and I can certainly see now that you talk about this how though there were more true arrangements, and somebody with the kind of training you had could have something to offer to something like that. What's your take on that album? Sometimes I read about people with mixed feelings about that album, and not to put words in your mouth, I always loved it to death. How did you feel it stacked up against the two before it?
It's a solid album. Bugsy's vocals are commendable. It had good songs on it. The first two albums were, except for the transition from Sam to Billy, it was all the same band. And so it shows that development, and it was a very simpatico ensemble. You know, it was a strong ensemble with a great deal of excitement. And, you know, Paul was powerful out front, very exciting. I don't remember if there was any open harp, you know, where he stepped back from the microphone with the harp on East West. I'm sure there wasn't on the first album, the one that was straight Chicago Blues. Drifting Blues, that's on the Big Boy Crab Show album. And Paul made a point of playing a solo there on open harp and then coming back to electric harp.
Now, one of the trivia questions I sometimes ask people is who is the only person who had a song covered on each of the first three, and it was Junior Parker. And I was Paul playing unamplified on either the Junior Parker tunes on either the first one or East West? Not the first one, I'm sure. There wasn't harp on. Yeah, there was harp on Mystery Train, but it sounds amplified.
Oh yeah.
And then All These Blues do you remember if he was playing amplified on that?
I think so, but I mean, why ask me when you got the record?
Yeah, that's true. Because you're here and the record's at home.
There you go. I already answered that as best I could. And I wrote a chart for my composition, Strawberry Jam, which was never recorded by Elektra Records, but I have a documentary recording that came out on the album called Strawberry Jam that we put out on Winter. Right. And that has arguably, I would argue, Paul's most emotional recorded harp playing, if you listen to it. When he comes in after Alvin's guitar solo, he is flying in the stratosphere.
To go back and check that. You know, we could stay here till spring just talking about what you did once you landed in the Bay Area. What you did was incredibly prolific and commendable in so many ways too, as an organizer, as a musician, as a promoter. But
I was not a promoter. I was a producer. I never promoted.
Right, a producer,
Yeah.
an organizer.
I produced under various umbrellas, county fairs, and I worked as a producer with the Monterey Jazz Festival and brought people together, musicians together there.
Was Marin part of a county fair, or was that
It ran for 20 years, starting in 1981. 18 of those years were at the Marin County Fair. They disembraced us for 2 years, and we staged elsewhere at Dominican College in San Rafael, and on the same weekend. And they lost attendance, I'm sure, and they brought us back. And we finished out many more years, but it was a good opportunity.
Well, like I said, we could talk about your Bay Area and subsequent adventures and fill a whole lot of time. In fact, we could talk about Percy for at least a few hours. But I think for now, I'll give you some time to see if this thing with Corky is going to happen. But before I do, I did want to ask you one last question, and just to continue the Chicago focus. Is there anything else you want to say about the impact that being at the University of Chicago or just being in Chicago had on your music? When people hear you today, is there something particular you can point to that you think is due to your having passed through Chicago?
Before I left Minneapolis, I was pretty familiar with Chicago blues. My friend Steve Tomes, whose family had the Leadbelly records, and we started listening to them. I was still in grade school, and I believe he was too. It was 4th or 5th grade I was in. Might have been as late as 6th. I don't think so. It's hard to be sure now, you know, but it's right in there. And he started developing a great 45 collection. He found where they sold to black people in the Twin Cities. It was a store in St. Paul, and he started collecting these 45s. And there were also some music that was on albums, such as Jimmy Yancey, I mentioned, Billie Holiday. He had the first Robert Johnson. Of course, I was collecting, and I wasn't collecting the way he was. I had not much of a budget, but I had some Fats Domino records. And Little Richard, you know, and they were very impactful on me, especially Fats Domino. But he had Chicago blues records, Muddy Waters, especially, and he had the first Robert Johnson album when it came out. I might have said that. And he had Bobby Bland records. And he had the J.B. Lenore record I mentioned, Luella. And he had John Lee Hooker. He had the album that had Nightmare Blues on it, which is, I think, still unsurpassed. I mean, still unsurpassed. I think it was unsurpassed in Hooker's repertoire. That was just it.
Yeah, the King album.
Yeah, and he had that, and so Chicago blues is the essence of my style. I think. What do you think?
Well, it's certainly a foundation, a key foundation.
Foundation's good enough. Maybe it's not the essence. I don't know from essence, but that's kind of where it started. And so when I lived in Chicago, I was able to absorb the feel of Chicago. I wasn't in blues clubs, but I was around the citizens of Chicago all the time, and I was not only on the campus because I lived off campus south of 61st Street. And when I went out to go to a restaurant, I went to 63rd Street. And we would eat at a Chinese restaurant called Thai Sam Yan, where they had a fixed price dinner, two choices, $1.75 or $2.35. And that was an agonizing choice for me because that's how tight it was. Everything was budgeted.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a lot of money for eating out, and 60 cents made a difference. Fact. I wouldn't turn down 60 cents now, to tell you the truth. What you got on you?
You got to squeegee my windows. Did you run into Otis Spann at all when you were here?
Not when I lived here, but when I was on the road and the Butterfield Band would co-bill sometimes with Muddy Waters Band. And I got to know Spann a little bit, enough to say hello. And I remember I went to see him sometime at Mother Blues, and I requested a song of his, and he said, "Oh, you're my friend." But I wasn't really his friend, except he liked me enough to say that, but it was not, when Percy said it, it really had a deep meaning.
Well, yeah, I mean, you didn't say it upstairs, but Percy, he did. It wasn't just Mark Naftalin Mayfield, it was my son, Mark Naftalin Mayfield.
Oh, I should have said that. Gosh, I missed my chance.
Yeah, really? Well, no, we have it for posterity. Well, thanks. I think we've touched the basis, stuff that's pertinent to this particular venue. So
just
thanks.
let me throw this in terms of horn arrangements and things that I contributed. I did mention Strawberry Jam, didn't?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was my composition. That was my horn arrangement, and Paul played the heck out of it. And when we were doing it, we were closing shows with it, and he never praised me for that song. And I wasn't looking for praise. But he never mentioned it to me, anything qualitative. Before, during, or after. He just played it. And closed shows with it. And, it's this kind of illustrates a little bit about Paul. I should save that for the panel. If that kind of thing's gonna come up, I don't know. But Paul was he was kind of a tough person. He had a tough exterior, but he had good values. When I brought Billy to California the first time to play at one of our festivals, this was after I started putting the Butterfield stuff out, and that's when I reconnected with Billy. I have artist contracts with my former bandmates, of course. And I brought him to California a couple times, and he played on our festival, and then we did gigs around the area. And we'd always been friendly to each other because he's such a friendly, wonderful person. Was, but this really gave me a chance to get to know him better. He stayed at our house. We spent time together, and he talked about the old days and getting in the band. And he said, and this may have been published elsewhere because may have been a set piece remark about Paul. It was very important to him, and it was important to him to let me know that when he expressed a very natural concern about what might confront him traveling with the band from the standpoint of racial discrimination, Paul said to him, "Where you can't go, we won't go." And the band never went south anyway. for that reason or not, I don't know. Kathy Butterfield, who was Paul's wife, she said that he wouldn't go. You know?
Yeah,
I never talked to
interesting.
him about it,
Huh.
but you know, that was important to Billy. He wanted me to know that, and that I think speaks. It makes an important point about Paul Butterfield.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hot on that mic.